Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted to find heaven on earth or simply a new perspective on life, then do we have the Already Here show for you. Today I'll be talking with Dr. Leo Galland, a world leader in integrative medicine and the best-selling author of numerous books including The Fat Resistance Diet, Power Healing, Superimmunity for Kids, and The Allergy Sollution, and a beautiful new book that'll bring tears to your eyes and open your soul, Already Here. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about life lessons from his son on opposites, presence, timelessness, and opening your heart. That, plus we'll talk about apple pancakes, grandma's cookies, Muppet movies, gotcha, the roller coaster at lake compounds, Italian Florence birthdays and jumping photographs, singing lessons and learning to ski, cheeseburgers and ecstasy, and what in the world Cristofo and Columbus has to do with anything. So welcome to the show, Leo. Are you ready to shine?
Yes, I am, Michael.
Woohoo!
All right.
So before we dive right into things, I've got to ask. We'll just start on this tone, and then we'll go back in time. How many years has it been since your son Christopher passed away?
Well, it's approaching 30, not quite.
Wow. So if we go back in time, then if we go back maybe to your earliest years, your years growing up, were you spiritual in your early years?
My basic attitude towards life has always been one of a skeptic who believed things. I believed things that I could experience and know.
Yeah.
And I always evaluated things in terms of their outcome. You know, very kind of nuts and bolts, outcome oriented. Does this change anything? If not, I'm going to move on to something that does change things.
So when you went into medicine, what was your take then on consciousness or life beyond life?
Well, unless I saw evidence of life beyond life, it was kind of irrelevant to me because it didn't change anything that I was going to do. I was still going to do the best I can to heal people. Consciousness, I always have considered to be very important. That is, the way that people think, I think, is important. But I looked at it from a very practical perspective. The way you think will condition what you do and will definitely impact on how you feel. So that was my approach to consciousness. In the broader sense, I viewed human consciousness as being a product of the human brain. That is, through the process of evolution, we developed brains that were unique and that actually helped enhance the survival of our species. So I came to my adventures with Christopher from a background that was strongly rooted in science, although I wasn't particularly reductionistic. I was very broad-minded and ready to think outside the box.
And that sounds important once Christopher came onto the scene.
Yes, it was. I mean, I'd already started to develop a career as a physician and a teacher in which I was problem solving in ways that I knew conventional medicine was not prepared to solve problems. But I wasn't prepared for Christopher.
So then if you could tell us about Christopher and Christopher's birth and also about Jonathan and Jeffrey then.
Well, Chris was one of triplets. His brothers were Jonathan and Jefferson and John and Jeff. And he was brain damaged shortly after birth. And so he just lived a very difficult life because of the brain injuries that he had sustained, probably from an episode of apnea associated with a surgical procedure. He was very uncoordinated. He would have scored very low on an IQ test. He had seizures. He had behavioral disturbances. He engaged in some kind of attention-getting behavior maybe every 5 minutes, which made him, he was a real handful. of course, some of the characteristics of Christopher I came to eventually see were not the result of his brain damage. They were who Christopher was. And one of the most salient characteristics of Christopher is that he loved engaging with other people. He would do anything to get a response from somebody else, except he wouldn't do anything mean or hurtful, but he was always trying to engage a person. And it wasn't to get attention, it was to be involved with that person, whether the other person wanted to be involved or not.
It sounds like the word, and we'll get to it later as far as the teachings that he gave you, but the word that he was demanding of you each and every moment is presence.
Oh, yes. He demanded presence. You could not ignore him. You could not multitask around Christopher. He always wanted you present with him, and he was always present with you.
Now, he did that with everybody except his grandma?
Well, he did it with his grandma, but she had more patience than anybody else. I mean, that's why I dedicated the book to her. I was just blown away by her ability to just stay there and be present with him as if there was nothing else in the world.
So important. So what did he do with electronics?
Oh, well, he could break anything. I mean, first of all, electronic devices fascinated him. I mean, he was a child before there were remotes, but in today's world, I don't know what Christopher would do with electronic games and devices. He wanted to play with anything and see what it would do. What was the effect of it? And what was the effect of breaking it? And, he broke John's cuckoo clock at one point, just because he was curious, what happens if you do this? And after he did it, he didn't feel any remorse or regret about it. He accepted the fact that, well, life is full of mistakes, so I have to do that because it's a mistake. And that was just the way he approached everything.
And he did this with, not out of malice, but he did it with people's emotions as well. He was a tinkerer's tinkerer.
Yeah, absolutely. He had no malice at all. During the course of his life, he did encounter a number of people who were pretty mean or hostile or angry. He never held a grudge against them. He might avoid them if they seemed really antagonistic, or more likely, he would try to engage them precisely because they were antagonistic. And he was going to win them over. He was going to show them that, hey, you don't have to be like that. But he never held a grudge, and he had no malice towards anyone.
So you could say, you were saying earlier that if we gave him a test, his IQ score wouldn't have done so well. But what about if we gave him an HQ test, a heart quotient test?
Oh, he would have soared, because his heart was always it was so full. It was always in the right place.
And what about his ability to forgive?
Off the charts. I've never known anyone like that.
So he comes into this world as a bundle of opposites, all heart and capable of poking and prodding any button, especially at a moment's notice.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the things that I realized about him after his death, might have started to see it before, but it really came into clear focus after his death, was his ability to size up people instantly along a particular scale and to elicit from them the opposite of what they thought about themselves. In other words, if you thought that because of his brain injuries, he wound up being in the company of many people who were far more injured and disabled than he was. People who were not vocal, who didn't even seem to be responding to others around them. People who others would try to ignore or just treat with custodial care. Christopher always approached them as human beings. He would say hello to them, even if they showed no evidence of recognizing that hello. He wasn't making a big deal about it, just the way he was. He was always kind and comforting to people who were in pain or distress. To people who saw themselves as losers and kind of incompetents, he would act in such a way that they would wind up taking care of him and feel good about
I
themselves
love it.
because they were taking care of him.
Mhm.
It was amazing. And then for other people who saw themselves as being smart or in control or rational or kind and were full of their kindness, he could drive them out of control. He could show you how stupid and irrational you are, and he could do it within minutes. So he could size up what your illusions or your ideas were about yourself,
Mhm.
and within minutes show you that the opposite was also true. And that was a unique genius that Christopher had.
Well, you just had a beautiful Freudian slip, which jumps ahead, and I want to continue the story. But let's go into that word here, because you just used a powerful word that he was pointing out to people before and after he passed away. Illusions, that we were attached and holding on to the illusion of who we believed we were.
Yes, right. It was as if he saw through that, or he saw around it, wasn't so much through, and he could see the opposite. And one of the things we had, Christopher was always walking into things and bumping into things. He had more scars on his face than if he were a prize fighter. And of course, he would never leave them alone. You try to keep him from picking at them, he would pick at them. So when he was about 15, we had his vision studied at the Gazelle Institute of Human Development in Connecticut, where I was the director of medical research at the time. And they had a great functional vision department. And the conclusion was that his visual field seemed to be like a series of competing images.
Mhm.
And I came to realize that it was that to the world, that to Christopher, the world must have looked like a Cubist painting, in which you see not just one side of things, but you see the other sides of everything all at the same time, which made it a little hard for him to walk. It made it a kind of a minefield,
Yep.
but it also was something that he could mine for understanding people, because he always saw that in people.
And it means if he's seeing the world from a very different perspective, and as you were talking about earlier, how we think changes everything. He was unable to focus on the world in the same way that we are. And it again jumps ahead, but one of the themes in the book is about getting locked in place, in time, in space, and being stuck in who or what we are, who and what we need to do. And with his different vision, that just didn't exist for him.
Right. It did. Space and time were totally different for Christopher than they were for me or for most people. I mean, he did keep track of time to the extent that he always wanted 3 meals a day. He thought brunch was ridiculous. How could you combine breakfast and lunch? He kept track of time in that kind of practical way. But outside of that, he lived in a different realm.
How did, coming from the linear world that you were coming from and that you were working with, how did he challenge you, and how are you able to keep yourself grounded and centered?
Well, I mean, when he was alive, he challenged me in the way he challenged everybody. He was just a handful to try and take care of. But the way that I understood our relationship was, Christopher's he's a pretty amazing person. What would he have been like if he wasn't brain damaged? That was about as far as I took it. And he was very dependent. He was dependent on me. I loved him. We all loved him. He loved us. And so we tried to take care of him. His death changed everything in ways that I never would have anticipated, because of what he taught me through his death, beginning with the immortality of his soul.
So before we go there, let's talk about life-sharing community, how he ended up there, and then what his last days were like there.
Well, when he finished his education at the age of 21, we found a place for him to go and hopefully grow as an adult. And there are communities that are called life-sharing communities. They are in the tradition of the Waldorf school system and the Camp Hill movement that were founded by Rudolf Steiner. And this particular community was in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Or at the time we were living in Manhattan. And so it was about 150 miles away. And in that community, people who are developmentally disabled or challenged or brain damaged live with other people who are not, or who are not in the ordinary sense, and they share their lives together. They live on farms, they work together, they build a community together, and each person's growth occurs through the growth of the community. Well, and it was a wonderful place. Christopher was a real challenge there, and he really challenged everybody there. I mean, his behavior could be terrible. So, and his individualism was inexhaustible. So the demands of the community were a challenge to him. He was there for 9 months, which may or may not be a meaningful period of time. But by the end of that time, he really had begun to change. And it was as if there was going to be a birth of Christopher into a new self, that he was really going to move on with his life in a different way. And then suddenly he died.
In fact, on that last morning, if I understand, he underwent, I guess there's this thing they do, a eurythmy, if I get...
Yeah, eurythmy is a form of symbolic dance. It's kind of like dance therapy with symbolic content. It was developed by Rudolf Steiner and his followers. And in the setting of life sharing, it basically is therapeutic. And there are a series of complex movements that people do together. This particular, I mean, frankly, I don't know how he did it. I would have a hard time doing what he did that last morning. But he did it perfectly, and it required not only moving and being aware of your own movements, but being aware of the movements of every other person. There are 10 people that are doing this together at the same time, moving in such a way that your paths intersect but do not collide. And he just did it perfectly. Then he went for a hike or a walk.
And you got a phone call later that morning.
Yes, during the course of the walk, I suspect he had a seizure. He had stepped away from the group, and he drowned in about 2 inches of water. It was early November. It actually was All Souls Day, if that is important.
Wow.
And so it was very cold. So it was 2 inches of cold water. I had lunch with Jefferson and with my wife. Jeff had just started a new job. And then I went back to my office, and my wife was going to come over there later. And when I returned, there had been a phone call 10 minutes earlier. Christopher was being resuscitated at an emergency room in Great Barrington. And he had come in. He was very, very cold. His body temperature was only 80 degrees. I asked the doctor to try and warm him and keep resuscitating him. And I waited. Christina, my wife, came back, and we just waited in gloom and darkness for what we feared would be the inevitable word that Christopher had died. And the thoughts that go through your head are unimaginable and unspeakable, fantastic wishes, unspeakable fears, then just kind of nothing. The weight of the world is on you. The air feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds. All of a sudden, we felt there was a feeling of electricity in the room that we were in my office, as if lightning were about to strike. And the room filled with pure white light. Now, we were not seeing this with our eyes. We were seeing it with our mind, and we were not in the room anymore at this point. Christopher was the source of that light, and we saw this being that was powerful, majestic, radiating an intense bliss, rising up at the center of the light. It had Christopher's face, but none of the scars. I mean, it looked perfect and beautiful. And there was this feeling of total joy and freedom. It's unlike anything I've ever experienced before or after. Lasted for a few seconds and then was gone. And you wanted to stay with it. I mean, that was the sensation you would like to spend eternity with. And the phone was ringing, and we knew what we would hear. Yes, they'd warmed him up. He was dead. We said, yes, thank you for trying. You can stop now. What was amazing about that experience, aside from the vision itself, and Christina and I had exactly the same vision. We compared notes. It was identical, was that it did nothing to relieve our grief. Now, maybe it would have been far worse if that had not happened, but we weren't feeling triumphant or joyful. We were feeling, downtrodden and like we'd been run over by a truck and very sad. And we had to go back and explain this to his brothers. The next event, if this was the only thing that had happened, I think that within a few years, I would keep remembering that experience, but I would begin to doubt that it was real. I'd start, because of the way my mind works, I would start thinking, well, Christine and I are really close. This was a very intense moment. This was a shared hallucination. I can understand that, but this isn't proof of anything outside that. We decided to bury Christopher in the Berkshires because he had been so important to that community and they to him. And at his graveside, we released 22 yellow balloons. I see that you have way more than 22 yellow balloons back there.
We looked for an image with 22 or 21, and this was as good as we can come up with. So abundance.
It's a great abundance. And now the balloons were all tied to a sandbag, and I couldn't untie them, so I had to cut them free from the sandbag. And each of them had a short yellow string about 12 inches long and a little ragged on the edges because somebody handed me a kind of dull pocket knife to do it. And we released them into the air. Now, the next day we were driving back to New York City to our home. And for some reason, we wound up taking the path we don't usually. And we came into Columbus Circle, which has a special significance for Christopher because it's Christopher Columbus Circle, or in Italian, Cristoforo Colombo. And I used to call Christopher Cristoforo, and he would laugh because it gave his name such a strange sound. As we stopped at a red light just before getting to Columbus Circle, a yellow balloon descended from the sky. Attached to it was about a 12-inch long yellow ribbon. It looked to be about a day old. It hovered in front of the car, and then it just kind of bobbed away. Christina and I were like totally thunderstruck by it. And there were 5 of us in the car, and we all saw it. This was not a vision. This was just a real thing that was right in front of us. In the back seat were 3 children, our youngest son, Jordan, and 2 of his friends. And to them, this was kind of like, yeah, well, of course. I mean, yeah, that was one of the balloons we released. And of course, Christopher sent it. What could be more natural than that? It didn't faze them at all. We were like just totally bowled over by this. And I felt as if Christopher were addressing me and saying, Leo, I know the way your mind works. You would have come to doubt the vision of my soul that I showed you. And so I'm sending you this. Now you just try to explain this away using any kind of logic or reason. So that, it was that 1-2 punch. Not only seeing Christopher's soul, but seeing the power and the majesty of his spirit. And then having this balloon is kind of more evidence of the immortality of my son that just really began to change the way that I viewed the world. Because once you accept the immortality of human consciousness, it changes everything. You have to be able to explain that to yourself. You have to be able to let that settle into who you are. And I wasn't sure if this was just Christopher, who is so amazing, or if this is something that we all have. But Christopher told me subsequently in one of the dialogues that he engaged me in, he said, I'm just like everyone else. And so, yeah, this is who we are under the skin.
Thank you so much for sharing. And you had several other experiences after that. In fact, one night, the most recent afterwards, I guess, you suddenly felt like you had a flu, the 6-hour flu.
Yeah, that was 3 weeks later. It was Thanksgiving, one of Christopher's favorite holidays. We're having a small dinner, and I suddenly felt overcome by this illness that I couldn't explain. I knew it wasn't the flu, but it felt like the flu, and I went to lie down and kind of went into a stuporous state. I mean, I could communicate, but I could barely move. And I began to feel as if Christopher were taking over my mind and body. And I was reliving his greatest disappointments and most traumatic experiences. And I came to know him in a way that I really hadn't understood. I could really feel the strength of his character and his ability to take disappointment and rejection and pain and turn it into love and joy. It was quite a remarkable experience for me. After that, I had no more visits from Chris for a long time. Christina, who's much more intuitive than I am, would often say to me, I feel Christopher's presence. I didn't feel anything. I mean, I tried to go along with it. I always wanted to be part of that. But I didn't feel anything. I just knew what I had experienced, and I got on with my life and my career.
Which must have been quite, I don't know if challenging is the right word, but you've just been given you've just uploaded a completely new paradigm for which to go back to work.
Right. Well, I thought about it. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. The one effect that it had is I had no fear of death anymore. And it's like, okay, so clearly you go from one state to another, and the other state looks like it's way more fun than this state. So what's there to worry about?
He taught you a lesson early on, and then we'll dive into him as teacher. But in this time where you had kind of this 6-hour flu, this is one of those early messages about confronting anger, hatred, and pain, and returning love. What
I realized, and he wasn't talking to me. This was a different experience than the ones that came later. It was more. I don't even quite know how to describe it, but what I was realizing that, there was a voice at one point actually, but I mean it was a very confusing set of events. What I realized is that life was difficult on purpose, that part of our job as human beings was to confront anger, pain, and hurt, and to give back love. That's why we are here, to do that. And that is alchemy. That is true alchemy. And that Christopher was a master alchemist. He did it better than anyone else I've known.
Doesn't that change everything? If you know that even the person who hurts you, hopefully metaphorically rather than literally, on you in the street corner, that any of these experiences is not what it appears to be.
Oh, yes, it definitely, it has a huge impact, and very demanding and difficult one. I wondered if I was really ready to absorb those lessons. I certainly tried to.
So if we go from there, when did he kind of visit you and you realize you're my teacher?
Well, that took a series of steps, and it was about 5 years later. The first event occurred in an airplane. Now, Christopher's last words to his mother were, "I can't wait to go on that trip." And this was a trip that he and I had planned with Jordan, our youngest son, to the Grand Canyon. And it never happened because he died. It was going to be a road trip. So I was flying from New York to California to give a workshop.
Yeah.
And this is the only time, I've made that flight dozens of times. This is the only time the plane flew over the Grand Canyon. As we approached the Grand Canyon and then flew over, the North Rim was visible from the right side, and I was sitting in a window seat on the right side. It was an amazing view. I felt as if I was actually leaving the airplane and was in Christopher's presence. Now, things like that don't happen to me. I'm not that kind of person. But this was pretty overwhelming. And so I immediately called my wife and said, "I got to tell you what just happened." I didn't even remember that those were Chris's last words until later. Then about 6 weeks after that, I woke up in the middle of the night with a voice saying, "You have to tell my story. People need to know." I recognized that that was Christopher. And so I started planning a book. And of course, the way I do things, I'm always very analytical and kind of academic. And I started in the morning, I told my wife about it. She looked at me, she said, "Book about Christopher is a great idea. Keep it simple. Just talk about Chris." So I took that advice. And I began planning and thinking about the book, which I was going to start writing in the summer. This was March. Well, I had a series of conferences and speaking engagements I had to go to. And the first one after that was at Palm Springs. And very, very busy, and I was very tired. And I was feeling kind of on edge about writing about Christopher, because what Christopher was showing me was so different from anything that I had previously done or written, or from the work that I was trying to teach, that I began to wonder if anyone would really take me seriously if I wrote this book. Would they take my work seriously again? At this point, I don't care, because they have taken my work seriously. So
you're free.
Yeah, I'm free. But so I was kind of troubled, and I was tired, and my wife had been in a motor vehicle accident and had almost been killed, and was really just, overcome with feelings about that. So while I was in Palm Springs, the middle of the night, I woke up. It's the second and only time that this has happened. And this voice is saying, "Tomorrow there will be a revelation in the desert." What does that mean? Okay, well, we'll see. Well, I had a trip planned to the Mojave Desert with Jordan to see wildflowers. It was a terrible trip. There were no wildflowers. The roads were crowded. Jordan was in a bad mood. I went back to Palm Springs and decided, okay, well, I need to get away from everything. I'm just going to take a hike. There's this colorless desert behind the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
It was hot. It was dusty. It's not a place that anybody would go to, but it was a place I could walk to for a couple of hours just to be alone. So I went out there and started walking, and I was really trying to figure out, okay, what do I want to be doing? I mean, do I want to be working like this? I have so many commitments. Maybe what I really want to be doing is mountain biking and body surfing and other stuff that I really like doing. And how can I get out of this? So I kind of threw out the words, "Okay, Chris, what should I do?" I wasn't expecting a response. And what I heard, and I wasn't hearing this with my ears, it was with my brain, "Follow my lead." And I thought, that's ridiculous. I mean, what do you mean, follow your lead? Here I am. I was in my 50s. I had all these responsibilities. You died. You were just a child. You died when you were 22. He just repeated it. He said, "Follow my lead." So I started thinking about, okay, follow your lead. Who were you, Christopher? What would happen if I were more like you? And I began to realize that Chris really had a lot to teach me about being in the world. And I felt this lightness of my spirit And then he said, teach and serve. And I said, I've been teaching and serving for like 25 years. I mean, I really am done with it. Then I realized that teach and serve referred to him, that he was the teacher and he had been serving, and that I needed to look at him as a model. And I felt this incredible sense of lightness in my being. And I said, okay, well, that's the basis on which I'm going to write this book. And so during the course of my writing, I would take walks and think about things, and I might put questions out to Christopher. I mean, they could be anything. It could be a question like, I'm thinking about Christopher's uncle, Jerry, and how he said, there's nothing wrong with my little Charlie, which is what he used to call Christopher. In fact, he's way ahead of us. Well, Jerry had died when Christopher was 15. I wondered, so I said, well, where's Jerry, Chris? Is he there with you? And, you know, often these would be kind of casual questions that I put out in my brain. And then he would come out with responses that wound up being very, very profound and challenging. And, of course, his response to that question was, well, where else would he be? Of course he's with me. But then that got him into a discussion about the illusory nature of place and space and time, and which was really very challenging.
What was he trying to teach you with that one?
He was trying to teach me that the world in which we live, or we see ourselves as living, is actually not the real world. It's just a small fraction of it. And that there is a world way beyond this world. What I realized, you know, when I keep having to apply my scientific background to what I learned from him, is that, yeah, that's exactly what physicists have been telling us for about 50 years. This world that we live in, characterized by the arrow of time, that's just a small fraction of the real universe, that there's so much more to it. And that's what Christopher was telling me. And in fact, that the underlying reality was much greater than I had ever really appreciated.
What did he call what is a God's moment or a God moment?
Well, he talked about, in talking about time, the first thing he said, by the way, was that the greatest problem that human beings have is we have illusions about space, and we're attached to place. Whereas spirits are with God, and God is everywhere at the same time. And he went into a discussion about the role of place and our attachment to place in creating separate boundaries between people and illusions about who we are.
Can I pause you for 1 second?
Sure.
How would he define place? Because we're not talking about simply geographical or temporal, for that matter.
Right. It's not just the place you're in, but your place in the order of things. That is, you know, what were your grades like? Where did you go to school? What's your job? How important are you? It's that kind of place, which to Christopher never meant anything in life. And in death, he's explaining to me, yeah, it doesn't mean anything. These are all illusions. People have problems because they're attached to those illusions. And of course, that's one of the characteristics of what Christopher told me. I eventually came to learn, to see that he was giving me lessons that were intrinsic to that were held sacred in so many human traditions. These were not things that he was inventing. That holy people have known about these for a long time, that they're kind of fundamental to living a spiritual existence. With regard to time, he said, that's the other great problem that people have, is that, you know, they're attached to time. But in reality, there is only one moment. That is God's moment. There is no before and after. Before and after is an illusion. Well, about 50 years ago, Albert Einstein said, past, present, and future are illusions. Physicists know that. So, I mean, he was right up there with Einstein.
Very cool. In fact, he one of the three main lessons that we're talking about today, gift of timelessness, is something you talk about simultaneous, or he talks about simultaneous awareness, which is kind of like what was going on with his vision as well.
Right. As I tried to think about what was I learning from Chris, I came up with these three themes that I call the gift of the opposite, the gift of presence, and the gift of timelessness. Now, for me, the gift of timelessness is the hardest thing to really wrap my head around and to understand, because like everyone else, I really am attached to the arrow of time, but even more so because so much of the professional work that I do involves the arrow of time. It involves looking at everything sequentially and understanding things rationally based upon the sequence of events. Whereas to Christopher, that way of understanding and awareness, that didn't mean anything. He had this gift of simultaneous awareness, in which he would see everything all at once. And that, of course, would allow him access to God's moment in a way that it was very difficult for me.
And if you can do that, if you can grasp even the slightest glimpse that time is not what it appears to be, it changes your perspective on everything in life, doesn't it?
Yes, that is. I would say that if there are, there's several things in Christopher's teachings that are game changers. That is one. That is the perception that that there really is only one moment, and that time, as we know it, the arrow of time, is a characteristic of just one small phase of that moment. And if you can unpin yourself from it and let your awareness drift outside it, it just changes everything.
How did it change things for you?
Well, it gives me an awareness of what heaven really is. Now, Christopher really had to bring that home to me. At one point, I asked him, and again, this was one of those offhanded kind of comments, that leads to a response that is way more than I ever expected. It was kind of like, well, what's it like in heaven, Chris? And he responded with joy, saying, it's what I always wanted. Everyone is here. Everyone. Even you. That gave me a chill that ran down my spine. But that wasn't good enough for me. So I had to say, well, what about the evil ones? Are they there? What about Adolf Hitler? I immediately regretted having asked that because of the cold feeling and the kind of darkness that came over me. But Christopher was real ready to handle that, although he did pause a bit. And he said, you have to understand the nature of evil. Everything bad is not evil. Evil originates in consciousness. And from there, he went into a description of why the universe exists, the relationship between heaven and earth, the nature of God, and understanding that why we are here. And that was the background to understanding the nature of evil.
So I've got to go into as many of these as I can in a very short period of time here. Nature of God.
God is love, or loving. That is, it's not that God loves. God is not something separate from us that loves us or loves the world. Love is God. And that is the energy that creates everything. And the reason there is a universe, and I'm giving you the quick rundown on this,
thank you,
is because loving requires separation. Love exists between beings. And so you need separate beings. And matter is ideally suited to the creation of separation because of its physicality. So basically, the energy, the loving energy that creates the world, needs the world in order to be able to exist itself and express itself. This is God's moment. This is what is happening. And we are here with our consciousness to participate in that. Evil occurs when individuals willfully subvert the purpose of their existence and turn against otherness instead of embracing it and loving the uniqueness of every single being.
Thank you. You had to have asked him, why the setup? Why are we here then? Why did we have to incarnate if it's all there, if it's all knowing?
Well, it's happening. I didn't really put it that way to him, but it seemed to me that this is the whole game. That is, love of otherness is what the universe is all about. And human consciousness participates in that. And the big change for me, I guess, this is one of the other game changers, but I do want to get to two others that are much more kind of down to earth, so to speak, is that I always viewed consciousness as arising from the evolution of the brain and matter. But actually what Christopher taught me is that consciousness is the substrate of the universe. The universe is an act of love. It is loving consciousness, and we find our place in it. And our brains are transmitters for that consciousness. We don't initiate the signal. We transmit the signal. That, for me, is a huge change in understanding.
Woohoo!
Yeah. I just want to mention the two other things that I think are really game changers. One is that I recognized that Chris's teachings were not just from beyond the grave, that in his short and difficult life, Chris actually lived those teachings, and he lived those principles, he lived those gifts, and was teaching us through the way he was, through all of the ways that seemed disagreeable or uncomfortable. Chris was always a teacher. And then finally, that everyone has Christophers in their life. There are a lot of Christophers in this world. People who are in pain or disabled or seem impaired or whom we'd like to ignore. We can learn so much from them. And what I hope from this book more than anything else is that people who read it learn to find and recognize the Christophers in their own life, because they will enhance your spiritual growth. And open your hearts and minds to them. That in many ways is the most important thing that can happen, whether or not you accept everything that Christopher taught me.
So thank you. And we have a few more minutes here. Dive into these two real briefly. The gift of opposite, because I think that's what he was teaching in each and every moment, is he would snap somebody to their opposite to shake them and to shake them out of, as you called it, the illusory nature.
Right. Well, the gift of the opposite basically is the recognition that everything contains its opposite, that the unity of opposites is the fundamental organizing principle of our universe. And this is also the fundamental organizing principle of ancient Chinese philosophy. Christopher didn't come up with this on his own. I review briefly the august history of the unity of opposites in human understanding. Christopher just embodied it in the way he lived. And it's an understanding that resonates from every page in that book. I mean, look, I didn't write this book as the expert. I was just a scribe trying to transmit the concepts from a far more advanced being who in life happened to be my brain-damaged son, who was totally dependent on me, but was really my teacher. What could be a clearer example of the gift of the opposite than that?
Woo! And then the gift of presence.
Right. The gift of presence. Presence is something that you need to really be able to understand God's moment and to see the opposite. You need to be fully present at every moment. The way that we live our lives is, we're accustomed to multitasking, to, to watching the clock. Everything that we do is by the clock these days. And we're overscheduled. So many of us, that was something that Christopher managed to escape. He would never give in to that. And he was always, there's a quote in there from an educational psychologist, a letter that he sent me about what it was like to eat lunch with Christopher. Christopher wouldn't speak while he was eating. And he acted as
what
if
was
he
it?
was
Something cheeseburger and
it was
ecstasy.
A cheeseburger. Yeah, right. And he said, and at the end of it, when he finished, John, Ed Cubetta, the psychologist, said, "Christopher, why wouldn't you talk to me?" He said, "I didn't want to talk while I was eating." And so John observed him the next time, and he saw that Christopher was at one with the cheeseburger. He was in a total state of ecstasy while eating it. And he wasn't going to leave that state of presence just to talk to someone he could talk to afterwards.
Woohoo! So, Christopher, what would he say? No, before we go there, what's the importance from Christopher of lightening up?
Oh, yeah, right. That gets us back to the talk about evil. So what he said about the evil ones was the source that they were eternally tormented because their attempts to subvert the purpose for their existence had created a schism in their souls that no love could heal. And then he said, there's pity in heaven for the evil ones. There's not anger, there's not condemnation, there's pity. But then he said, I can't say that dampens our joy because that's the way it always was and always will be. Well, that was kind of depressing to me because I'm someone who likes to always try and improve things and make them better. And I spend my life doing that. So I kind of, retreated to my study and I was brooding. Christopher came to me very gently, knowing that he had upset me. And he said, I said to him, so the universe can never be perfected. And he said, not the way you want it to be. And he said, you know how you like to tell stories about all the quirky, crazy things that I did when I was alive? Well, around here, some of us like to tell stories about you, about how you always tried so hard to get everything just right. And he said, lighten up. You're already here. Which, of course, cracked me up.
And became the name of the book.
And became the name of the book, Already Here. So that is an understanding of timelessness. We are already in heaven. We are there. Heaven is not a place that you go to after you die. We are there, and we can be there. And there's no end to it. There's no beginning, and there's no end. There's no before, and there's no after. There's no loss. And if you can unpin yourself from the arrow of time, even for a few seconds, and allow yourself to experience God's moment, it is joyful and can really change your life. But you have to lighten up to do that.
Woohoo!
Okay.
If I took off my coaching hat and I put it on you, or if we could somehow put it on Christopher today, because we don't want people leaving here today without actually taking action on what they're learning, this new way of, new for many, way of experience, of beingness. It's a paradigm shifter. What would you challenge people or ask people to do?
Well, actually, I think it would be to look for the Christophers in your life. I mean, everybody is going to have a different path for learning this. For some, it would be a meditation. There's some people who are already most of the way there. I mean, they don't need to be convinced of immortality or the eternal present or God's moment. I think the real challenge, practically, is to look for the Christophers in your life. Open yourself up to the gift of the opposite. You have to be fully present for that and see what they teach you.
Beautiful. On that note, what advice would you give parents for their kids, or maybe if they have kids with lots of opposites?
Again, what can you learn from this child? I mean, I treat a lot of kids who are sick, chronically ill, and what actually amazes me about them is the tremendous spirit that they have, and the love that their parents have for them. What can you learn from the spirit of your sick or injured child? I think you can learn a lot from it.
That's huge. That's absolutely huge. On that note, what personally brings you the greatest happiness, or what I call the woohoo moment?
Well, I love being with my family. And for Christopher, I think the release of this book is probably doing that, because he so loved to interact with other people. And now he's getting to interact with thousands.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. So on that note, where can people go to find out more and to find your book or Christopher's beautiful book?
Okay. Already Here is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, in bookstores. If you go to my website, drgalland.com, and click on Already Here, there are links to different places that are carrying it in different countries. And there's also a kind of an essay that I wrote called Dr. Galland Talks About Already Here, which expands on many of the themes that we discussed today. Perfect,
perfect, perfect. Any last words of, well, actually, give me the URL one more time for people, if you don't mind.
Dr. Galland, drgalland.com.
Fantastic. And if you didn't catch Dr. Galland, galland.com, come on over to inspirenationshow.com, and we'll get you over to Dr. Galland, galland.com as well. Thank you so much. This has been so beautiful. Any last words of wisdom you want to share with people today?
Follow your heart. Open your heart. And open your mind, and follow what you find. The connections between people exist independently of the people. We don't create them. Let's find our place in that connectivity, because that is what is sacred in the universe.
Woohoo! Thank you so, so much, Leo. This has been a true treasure and a treat. Everybody, I can't recommend the book enough. There's so many beautiful, profound lessons that are all put together actually here quite succinctly. They're life lessons to digest, but they're easy to take in from this book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's a story. It's not an essay or a series of essays. It's a story, and some people have told me it's a page turner.
Absolutely. Absolutely it is. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get already here, and begin looking for your own Christophers today, and shine bright. Woohoo!
Thank you.
Thank you so, so much, Leo.
This was great. You're terrific, Michael. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like below. Also, leave your comments. Have some real fun with it. Subscribe to our channel where you're going to get more great videos, more interviews coming up. And check out our website, inspirenationshow.com. That's where you'll find tips, blogs, information, videos you won't find anywhere else, and useful and helpful resources to really help you kickstart your life and to shine bright. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your support. Like, comment, subscribe. See the website. Thanks so much and have fun. Of course, shine bright. Woohoo!